You know, if you ask me 20 years ago, tell me one simple thing that's wrong with economics, I would say it's too much abstract theorizing and not enough looking at the real world, not enough data. We need to be more empirical. And there's a part of me that still says that. But it also, this revolution has gotten to the point where people are not thinking in theoretical terms. It's a theoretical empirical work. And the problem with that is that you can't do a theoretical empirical work. You have to have an interpretive framework. Kuhn was right. And if you don't have an interpretive framework that's informed by mainstream economics or some heterodox program, you're going to just be putting common sense on it. And, you know, as we can tell from recent politics, common sense doesn't necessarily work very well. I'm Douglas Wade Hands, but the D is suppressed, so it's D Wade Hands, since I go by Wade. I'm at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. One of the reasons that philosophers of science have become interested in economics comes from the philosophy of biology. With climate change and global warming and all of those topics, questions about the epistemic warrant of the models that are used in those fields have opened up. There's a lot of, right, we're going to change the policy of the world on the basis of these models. And these models are very mathematical. These models cannot be tested in the traditional way because you're talking about what's going to happen way out into the future with a whole lot of variables. And what philosophers of science discovered is, wow, they look like economic models. They're mathematical, they have a lot of assumptions, nothing works unless the assumptions are true, and yet these are models that we trust and we believe in and we're willing to do policy on. What can we learn from economic modeling about this whole process? So that's one of the things where philosophers have become involved. Another one is this what some people are calling the rationality wars. Behavioral economics has set off a fire in terms of the rationality of individual agents. I think most economists would nowadays say that maximizing a well-behaved utility function might be useful for some things. It's still part of the core of economics, but there's a whole lot of anomalies out there. And it's not just Kahneman and Tversky, there's a lot of anomalies of the rational choice theory. And that topic has always been of interest to philosophers. I mean, there were philosophers of decision theory long before behavioral economics. And so the philosophers doing that topic and philosophers of economics have become intertwined. Plus, that has both a positive and a normative aspect to it. You assume rationality oftentimes in economics for scientific purposes to predict and explain behavior. But oftentimes in economics, we use it in a normative way, and it's used that way by certain behavioral economists. Kahneman and Tversky talk about normative standards, right? Like in libertarian paternalism, if you're making a mistake, you need to be corrected. Well, the mistake is that you're not behaving rationally according to expected utility theory or no utility theory or whatever. And so this is a nice topic for philosophers because it mixes positive and normative up in a very complex way. And so there's been a lot more work. But that old approach of sort of going and finding your favorite philosopher of science and then taking that position and just applying it to economics without thinking about what economists do that's different than physics or whatever. That's not what's going on. What's going on is a much more complex process of where you have some philosophical ideas and you have some ideas about scientific modeling, and then you look at economics and you mix those things together and you come up with a composition that's not just blindly trying to apply philosophy. So there still is a bit of that, but primarily that has disappeared. And some of that has to do with what's going on in philosophy of science, because philosophy of science is quite different than it was in the old days when philosophers sat around in their easy chairs and said, gosh, what is science? Let me tell you what science is. And philosophy of science itself is much more empirical and much more naturalistic than it used to be. I mean, one of the things that's happened with the field of economic methodology or philosophy of economics developing on its own There's some specialization in division of labor. When I was right out of graduate school, I sent a lot of papers to Hope and things like that, and you could do some history, but you could also do some philosophy, so on and so forth. And we're getting this specialization in division of labor. There's a lot more archival work in the history of economic thought today than there was in the past. And a lot of historians have moved in that direction. Now, I'm not saying the majority of historians of economic thought think that, but many of them would argue if you're not doing archival work, you're not really doing the history of economic thought. And on the other hand, you have this field of economic methodology with a whole lot of philosophers working in it. And so what we're getting is we're getting a lot of separation. It's always been a bit of a problem for me because I really am both. Anything I've ever written that's methodological, I start with a particular historical episode in economic theory, not a historical episode in political history, and then weave the philosophical discussion in. And I'll just give an example. I have a couple papers on revealed preference theory that were published a few years ago, and one ended up in Hope and one ended up in Mercantinus, which is a philosophy of science journal. Those two papers started out as one paper, and the historians said there's too much philosophy, too much normative stuff, and the philosophers thought there was too much historical stuff. So I split them out into two papers with about a 1/3 overlap, and everything's fine. But the point is, there's still a lot of interaction. There's no doubt about it, but the interaction has changed. You need to direct historical papers at historical readers and methodological papers at methodological readers. Given what a dismal failure macro and finance were in terms of either predicting or recommending policies, you would think that people would run to economic methodology to figure out what happened and why did the science fail and what do we need to do to fix the science and so on and so forth. But it was not a flurry of activity. At the Journal of Economic Methodology, we get 3 or 4 macro papers a year out of 100 papers. The big impetus has been behavioral economics, neuroeconomics, those kinds of choice theoretic things. I mean, behavioral economics has implications for macro, right? But most people aren't writing papers about macro or finance. They're writing papers about behavioral welfare economics, neuroeconomics, the empirical revolution in some sense, the data-driven randomized controlled trials, those kinds of things are hot topics. There was an interest among economists in methodological topics after the financial crisis, but there wasn't a whole lot of papers written on economic methodology directed at macro or finance or those kinds of issues. I expected this would have a profound impact on how we think about economic science. Certainly the Keynesian Great Depression had a profound impact on how we think about economic science, but it really didn't. And there's a lot of things that matter, but that has not been one of the major forces. There's a lot of discussion about the, data-driven economics and, of course, experimental economics in the narrow kind of Vernon Smith sense, as well as behavioral economics and behavioral welfare economics. And in some sense, all of that is broadly experimental compared to, general equilibrium theory or something. If you define the empirical turn, as some people call it, to include behavioral economics and all that, then yeah, that is the main thing that people talk about. And I think that it will take quite a while for historians to get far enough past this change to make sense of it and to understand, both from philosophy of science point of view and also historically, how it happened and what the implications are going to be and how much it means we're going to be doing economics without theory. I mean, there is a technological component. I mean, big data and fast computers and all this stuff is important. And economists, have traditionally argued that technological change matters, right? And technological change may matter in how we do economics as well. And so there's a story to be told there, but it's work to be done. It's a hot topic, but not one that is settled. So.